I'm told that this is a lecture series where you usually hear from architects, and I've got all kinds of drawings up there for you to look at, but it's going to be different tonight. I'm speaking to you not as architects or as architectural students, but in your role as citizens, as residents of this democratic society. And let me begin by reviewing, a history that I think almost all of you are familiar with, and that is in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began actually in the 1930s when civil rights lawyers challenged segregation, racial segregation in law schools, because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out you couldn't get a good legal education in an inferior and segregated law school. And then that precedent was used to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities that used to be segregated. And then that was used as the basis for challenges to racial segregation in elementary and secondary schools, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 that declared that legal residential segregation was unconstitutional in elementary and secondary schools. And there are seats up here in the front if you want to come up here and take them. I know I'm in a university now and people think if they sit up front, the teacher's going to call on you, but it's not going to happen. And that Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education decision, gave inspiration, stimulus, momentum to a nascent civil rights movement of activists who engaged, as many of you know, in marches and demonstrations, civil disobedience. Many of them lost their lives in that struggle. And by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had succeeded in ending racial segregation, not only in schools and colleges and universities, but in everything from water fountains to buses to lunch counters to interstate transportation and public accommodations of all kinds. And yet, at the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement folded up its tent and went home and never addressed the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. Everyone. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could that be? The civil rights movement, and indeed much of the country, came to understand that racial segregation was wrong. It was harmful not only to blacks, but to whites. It was immoral. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How can it be that it left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We're an apartheid society. Well, partly, I guess you could say, it's harder. You referred to this a minute ago. It's harder to desegregate neighborhoods and to desegregate lunch counters. If you prohibit the segregation of lunch counters, the next day you sit anywhere you want in a restaurant. But if you prohibit segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, we've adopted a national rationalization, a myth, an excuse we give ourselves for not dealing with the biggest segregation of all. And that myth goes like something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges or universities or lunch counters or buses, that was all done by government, by public policy, by law, by regulation, by ordinance. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, civil rights violation, unconstitutional, had to be remedied. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, civil rights violation, had to be remedied. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. Government didn't do that. That just sort of happened by accident. It happened because, bigoted white homeowners. More seats up in front. It won't bother me, just walk up. It happened because bigoted white homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe because actors in the private economy, like real estate agents or banks, discriminated in how they carried out their private economic activities. Or maybe it happened because whites and blacks just like to live with each other of the same race, and if other race people move into our neighborhoods, we move. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's self-segregation. Or maybe it's income differences. Maybe it's because on average, not everyone, but on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so many of them can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but private economic activities, income differences, self-selection, all of these is what's created residential segregation. And if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We give a name to this rationalization. It's, again, one that all of us use. I used it until I began to think about this more deeply. Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, we all use it. We say it's de facto segregation, a term we're all familiar with, segregation that just happened in fact, not in law. And if it's de facto segregation, we don't think it's a good thing. Most of us wish it didn't happen, but there's nothing we're obligated to do anything about because it's not a civil rights violation. It's not unconstitutional. Well, I spent most of my last 30 years or so writing about education policy, not about this. I'm only recently learning about housing. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent most of my time criticizing the dominant education policy of this country. And I see some of you are probably too young to remember it, but many of you will. In the 1990s and 2000s, we had a theory in this country, which was shared across the political spectrum, that the reason that African-American children and white children didn't have equal outcomes, African-American children, on average, again, there were many exceptions, but on average had lower achievement than white children. The reason was that teachers had low expectations of black children. And if only teachers raised their expectations, expected black children to achieve at higher levels, they would do so. Now, it seems like a pretty silly theory, but I can't emphasize to you how widely shared that was only 30 years ago. In 2001, we passed a law called the No Child Left Behind law. It was sponsored by the president, a Republican president, George Bush, in the Senate by the most liberal Democratic senator, Ted Kennedy, in the House by the most liberal Democratic congressman, George Miller. And the law said that within 7 years, the achievement gap will disappear if only we test children more and hold teachers accountable for their test scores. And as I said, I thought that was a pretty silly theory. It was dangerous. And I tried to explain in many of the columns and articles I wrote why I thought that theory was so silly. And I won't go into it in great detail this evening because that's not the topic of this lecture. But for example, I remember writing a column about asthma. Because, I think many of you probably know, African-American children in urban areas in this country, low-income urban areas in particular, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. And they have asthma at 4 times the rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child quite possibly might be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day, maybe even sleepless. And you all know some statistics. I tried to explain that if you had 2 groups of children that were identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, except that one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement. Because no matter how often you tested a child, and no matter how much you held the teacher accountable for the test scores, the teacher was going to make the child more wide awake when he or she came to school. And I wrote column after column about these different conditions that predict the achievement gap, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning, which is also characteristic of less well-maintained buildings, has a measurable effect on cognitive ability, or homelessness, or economic insecurity. You could do the same syllogism with every 1 or 2 groups of children, identical except for this one characteristic that would produce lower achievement. And if you add them all up, they explain a good part of the achievement gap. But then as I thought about this more, it suddenly dawned on me, I'm sort of a slow learner. It should have dawned on me much earlier. But it's one thing if a child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity? How can that school ever be expected to have the same kind of achievement as a school where children come to school healthy and well-rested and in secure homes? You can't possibly expect that. And we call a school like that a segregated school. And the reality is that today, schools in this country are more segregated, more racially segregated than they have been at any time in the last 50 years. More segregated here in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And the reason is that our neighborhoods are more segregated. Well, these are the kinds of things I was thinking about, and then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. The US Supreme Court was evaluating a program of two school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. And both of those school districts were trying to address this problem of segregation in their schools. And so instead of assigning children to the schools in their neighborhood, which were racially homogeneous, both districts gave parents the choice of which school in the entire district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, make it worse, that choice would not be honored in favor of a choice of a child who would help to minimize racial segregation. So if you had an all-white school or a mostly white school, and you had one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference. It's a trivial program, trivial. How often do you have a case where one place is left in a school and both a black and a white child apply for it? But the Supreme Court examined this program. They denounced it, said it was unconstitutional to do such a thing. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, not majority controlling opinion in the case, and he explained that the reason you couldn't do such a thing was that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were, he said, segregated. He admitted that. He said the reason they were segregated was that the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's exactly why the schools in those communities were segregated. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated de facto for all the private, non-governmental reasons that I described before. And he explained, if you have de facto segregation, you're prohibited from doing anything about it. If government didn't create it, government can't uncreate it. Well, I read this decision. As I said, it came from two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And reading this decision, I remembered reading about a case that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the districts that this decision concerned. And in Louisville, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb called Shively, single-family homes outside the city of Louisville. He had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife, a child, a good job, middle-class guy. Wanted to move to a single-family home in a suburban area. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second house in the suburb, and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. Police were there in full force. The neighbors threw rocks through the windows. The police somehow couldn't stop that. They firebombed and dynamited the home, and the police somehow couldn't do anything about that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, all agents of state government were mobilized to maintain racial boundaries in the city of Louisville, and I looked into it further, I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police-protected mob violence in American cities. Los Angeles had many of them. American cities in the mid-20th century that drove African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in neighbors surrounding urban black neighborhoods. Hundreds and hundreds of these cases. Every one was a civil rights violation if the police were involved in not stopping it. And then as I looked into it further, I found that not only were there 14th Amendment violations stemming from police violence in the criminal justice system's mobilization in defense of segregation, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, all of them unconstitutional, that contributed to the racial segregation that we know today. In fact, contributed so heavily that we wouldn't have the kind of racial segregation that we know today were it not for very, very powerful, racially explicit government policies. So let me spend a few minutes with you this evening describing some of the major policies that the federal government followed in order to ensure racial segregation. I don't have time to go into very many of them, but I'll talk about a couple of federal policies. And as some of you know, I go into many, many others in this book, The Color of Law. One is public housing. Now, most people I speak to, maybe you architecture students are different, but most people I speak to have a misimpression of what public housing, how it evolved and what it is. They think of public housing as a place necessarily where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, engaged perhaps in oppositional behavior, getting engaged in confrontations with the police, deteriorated buildings. That's our image of public housing mostly in this country today, but that's not how public housing began in this country. The first civilian public housing in this country was created during the New Deal and the Depression by the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Poor people were not permitted in public housing. It was not for poor people. We had a very high unemployment rate in the Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs and could pay the full cost of housing and their rent. It wasn't a subsidized program. The first New Deal agency that built the first civilian public housing in this country was the Public Works Administration. Built housing in many cities across the country. Everywhere it built them, it segregated them, creating separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites. Frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Turning integrated neighborhoods into segregated ones with public projects. And that may surprise you. But there were many, many more integrated downtown working class neighborhoods in this country in the mid-early 20th century than there are today. Many more. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that part of the 20th century to see the extent of integration. Not everywhere, but the extent of integration that existed. And if you think about it, you realize it had to be. We were a manufacturing economy at that time. There was none of this internet stuff. Factories had to be located near deep water ports, near railroad terminals. That's where they got their parts and shipped their final products. And if you had a factory district near a port or railroad terminal that had both black and white workers, they had to live near the factories so they could walk to work or take short streetcar rides. They didn't have cars to drive into the suburbs. There were no suburbs. These were integrated neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration segregated many of them. Some of you, I hope more of you in the future will be, but some of you are familiar with the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. He wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. You wouldn't be surprised at that in an integrated high school because it was located in an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood in Cleveland, it was called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for African Americans, one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed, and then reinforced with other projects elsewhere in the city of Cleveland. In my book, as some of you who've read it may know, where I can, I try to discuss self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than every place else. Not necessarily Los Angeles, but maybe a little bit. Cambridge, Massachusetts. How about that one? The area between Harvard and, are you familiar with Cambridge, Massachusetts? Yeah, a few, okay. The area between Harvard and MIT, it's called the Central Square neighborhood. was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, half white, half black. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation not only in Cambridge, but with other projects like that in the Boston metropolitan area that determined the racial landscape that we know today in that metropolitan area. During World War II, the federal government's intensity in creating racial segregation continued. In that period, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in the war economy that hadn't existed during the Depression. It ramped up very quickly. These workers flocked to centers of war production from rural areas, from small towns. The government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft carriers to be produced. It had to find housing for these workers. And so it did. And everywhere the government built housing for war workers, it built it on a segregated basis. These are for workers working in the same war plants, same shipyards, same aircraft carriers, but built segregated housing for them, creating segregation in many places where it hadn't previously existed. And here, the West Coast is a very good example. There were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. Historians divide up the migration of African Americans out of the former slave states into the rest of the country into two big periods. The first Great Migration, which took place during World War I, and that's when African Americans left the South and came to places like Detroit, and Chicago, and New York, and Pittsburgh. They didn't come to the West Coast. Very few came here in that period. It was the second Great Migration during World War II, when African Americans came to take jobs in the war industry here, that brought them for the first time here to the West Coast. So when the government created segregation with these war plants, it was doing it where there was no even previous informal pattern of segregation prior to that. In San Francisco, the area where I now live, the government built 5 projects for war workers. 4 were for whites only in existing white neighborhoods of Chicago, of San Francisco rather. And it built 1 for African Americans in what's now known as the Fillmore District. A segregated separate project. It was built in the Fillmore District because there were lots of vacant apartments there. Japanese who had lived there had been relocated to internment camps farther inland. And so there were vacancies. Some African Americans moved into there, so the federal government decided that was going to be an African American neighborhood. And that's where it built its project for African American war workers. And in Portland and Seattle, here in Los Angeles, Watts didn't used to be a black neighborhood, wasn't before World War II. That's where the government decided to put projects for African American war workers, was in Watts. Became a black neighborhood as a result. All of these West Coast communities were segregated for the first time by these activities during World War II. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage in the country. It was a homelessness crisis, much like we have today. There were people living in open fields, in Quonset huts, doubled, tripled up with relatives at that time, because there were millions of returning war veterans coming here needing housing, having jobs in the post-war economy. They could afford to pay rent, but there was no housing available. None had built during the Depression except for those few government projects I talked about. During World War II, it was illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for war workers. So there was that big backlog, and then, as I said, millions of returning war veterans forming the baby boom after they came back from overseas, needing housing. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, had to respond to this housing crisis, and he did. He proposed a vast expansion of the nation's public housing program. Again, for working families, returning war veterans, people who had jobs who could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent, not for poor people. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's public housing expansion. They wanted to defeat it, not for racial reasons. It was segregated. They were comfortable with that. It was because they didn't like poor people. There were no poor people in public housing to speak of at that time. They wanted to defeat it because they thought public housing was socialistic. The private sector should be taking care of the housing needs of returning war veterans, not the government. Not that the private sector was taking care of those needs. So they came up with a device that is referred to, and some of you may have heard this term, a poison pill strategy to defeat the 1949 Housing Act that Truman had proposed. Are you familiar with that term? Anybody heard of it? No. Okay, well, a poison pill strategy is a strategy where opponents of a bill in Congress propose an amendment to the bill, which they think can get passed. They think they can get a majority for this amendment. The amendment is then passed, is attached to the full bill, and then when the full bill comes up to the floor of the House and Senate, as amended with this amendment that they proposed, a different majority, because of that amendment, finds the bill objectionable and the bill goes down to defeat. So the amendment is called a poison pill amendment. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment along the following lines. So from now on, public housing has to be non-discriminatory. No more of this segregated public housing business. We're going to have non-discrimination, no racial discrimination in public housing. It was, of course, a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought they could get some northern liberals to vote with them. That would create a majority. The amendment would pass. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of the House and Senate, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who are all in favor of segregated public housing but not integrated public housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. Liberals in Congress then had a difficult decision to make. They were being faced with a devil's bargain. Were they going to support the integration amendment and ensure that no housing would be built to address the housing crisis that they faced? Or were they going to oppose the integration amendment in order to save the expansion of public housing? I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the choice. It's a very difficult choice they had to make. I'm spending some time on this because it's exactly the choice that you face today when it comes to the affordable housing crisis. It's exactly the choice you face today. The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. His closest colleague was someone who some of you may remember and others have heard of, a senator from Minnesota. He was called Mr. Civil Rights, Hubert Humphrey. They had to decide what to do. And they decided they were going to campaign against the integration amendment in order to save public housing. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he persuaded them not to vote for the integration amendment. The integration amendment was defeated. The full housing bill was passed as an ongoing segregated program. The federal government then used that vote in Congress against non-discrimination in public housing as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs for the next 15 years. I'm not so sure that Douglas was right, that anybody was better off as a result of that devil's bargain that he made, although I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the choice. As a result of the later intensified segregation that resulted from the continued vast expansion of public housing on a segregated basis, we not only got the achievement gap that I began by describing, by concentrating the most disadvantaged minority children in single neighborhoods, we got health disparities between African Americans and whites. We all know that African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of heart disease, because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more dangerous neighborhoods. We got the mass incarceration crisis that we're all so familiar with, which could not result if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs or opportunity. And I think another result of this devil's bargain that we made in 1949 is something we're paying a big price for today, and that's the growing and very, very dangerous political polarization we have in this country today that not entirely, but largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop, to maintain the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other, there with no ability to empathize with each other or understand each other's life experiences? So those are some of the results of the compromise that was made. Well, under that vote to vastly expand public housing, many of the giant public projects that we're familiar with in this country were built. Vast expansion of public housing, and you're familiar, they're in this community. They're all over the country. The most famous probably is Pruitt-Igoe, which I imagine maybe you study in architecture school in St. Louis. We call it Pruitt-Igoe. It was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. Not because African Americans liked the sound of the name Pruitt and whites liked the sound of the name Igoe, so they all applied to different projects. These were racially explicitly designated projects like all the others I've described by the federal government and local housing agencies. Very soon after it was built, in the early 1950s, something happened that was quite surprising to housing experts, to people like yourselves. All of a sudden, large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects and long waiting lists in the black projects. Pretty soon, even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't defend publicly a situation in which some of these projects were half empty and others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were opened up to African Americans, and public housing became predominantly an African American institution. And then something else happened about the same time. Those factories that I mentioned before that had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals, they moved to the suburbs, to rural areas. Highways were being built. They no longer needed to get their parts and ship their final products from a railroad terminal or a deep water port. When the factories moved, people living in the urban areas, African Americans in public housing and in the private market, lost good jobs. Soon, those living in public housing could no longer pay the full cost of housing in their rent as they had been doing before. Government had to be subsidized, began subsidizing housing. Once the government began subsidizing public housing in the mid-20th century, it stopped maintaining them. The projects started to deteriorate. And we got the kind of urban slums that we're familiar with today. But it's important to remember, and I'm sure some of you already know this history, it's important to remember that's not how public housing began and not how it needs to be. But the question, I hope some of you are asking, some of you may know the answer if you read my book, but is why did all those vacancies occur in the white projects and not the black ones? These were all returning war veterans living in them who had jobs in the post-war economy. Well, the reason for that was a different federal program that was even more explicit, more powerful in creating segregation in this country. And that was an explicit design of the federal government to move the white working class population out of urban areas into single family homes in suburbs that would ring every city in the country. And the suburban developments that do now ring every metropolitan area in this country were primarily created by the Federal Housing Administration for whites only. And you're familiar with all these projects. You know them by name. Some of you may know, some of you may have heard a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Melvin Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. Some people are not. I guess more people know that than know what a poison pill strategy is. That's okay. That was a development south of San Francisco. A giant development, 15,000 homes in one place. Another one that you know probably is the biggest one was Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. Remember, we weren't a suburban country when these were developed. The working class, white working class, as well as black workers, were living in urban areas, not in suburbs. When Levitt or Henry Dolger, the builder of the area south of San Francisco, wanted to build these giant suburbs, no bank would lend them the money to do so. No bank would lend them money to buy the land or to build the homes. They had no buyers for them yet. The bankers thought this was a crazy idea. Nobody's going to want to live in suburbs. It's single-family homes in suburbs when they could live in cities. What a crazy idea. The only way that Levitt or Dolger or any of these other developers could build these projects is by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for approval. The architectural design of the homes had to be submitted, the layout of the streets, the building materials that we're going to use, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and these other builders to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit racial program of the federal government. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. The Federal Housing Administration distributed a manual to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to review applications of builders for federal guarantees for their bank loans to build these suburbs, and the manual said explicitly that no federal guarantee could be given to a bank loan that was going to be for an integrated development. The federal manual even said you couldn't guarantee a bank loan for a development that was going to be for all whites if it was located near where African Americans were living, because such a development would, in the words of the manual, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. This action of the Federal Housing Administration to suburbanize the country on a whites-only basis is responsible for much of the landscape that we know today. The homes at the time that were built in these suburbs, Levittown or the Westlake development, the little boxes on the hillside, and many, many others like it, were very modest, inexpensive homes. They were for returning war veterans, working class families. 750 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, very modest homes. They sold at the time for $8,000, $9,000. If you were a returning war veteran, you needed no down payment. In today's money, that's probably around $90,000, maybe $100,000. Easily affordable to any working class family with a job. It's about twice national median income. The white families who bought those homes with a federal guarantee, bank guarantee with FHA or VA mortgages, gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to maybe take care of temporary unemployment emergencies, maybe a medical emergency. They used it to cushion their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their own children and grandchildren for down payments on their own homes. African Americans who were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating exercise got no such benefits. The result is that today, on average, African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. I'm not going to talk tonight about how that disparity arose. That's a different lecture. I'll have to come back to the time and give that. But just take it from me. The income ratio between African Americans and whites is about 60%. African American wealth is only 10% of white wealth, or less. By some measures, it's 5%. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that's never been remedied, and that we, Americans, have never undertaken the responsibility to remedy. You add that wealth gap, which is the most serious contributor to racial inequality in this country today, to the achievement gap in schools and the health disparities and the mass incarceration and our political crisis. And I think you'll have to agree with me, we've got a problem here. The policies to redress segregation are well known to many of you, to housing experts, to people working in think tanks, to editorial writers, even to government officials. We know what to do. The government created this, the government could uncreate it just as easily. We could, for example, to take the most extreme example I can think of, but one that's certainly constitutionally defensible, begin buying up homes in Levittown or Westlake, the place south of San Francisco, at current market rates, $500,000, $600,000, whatever they might sell for, and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. I've talked about this history to groups of lawyers, the American Bar Association, and law schools. Nobody's ever told me that that's not a very reasonable constitutional remedy that would have to be upheld by any court that recognized the history that I've just described. But we have many more less radical proposals to redress this. We should be abolishing and challenging zoning codes in these suburbs that frequently have adopted more stringent zoning codes as the years go on that prohibit anything but single-family homes, frequently on large lot sizes, from being built, prohibit townhouses or apartments, even single-family homes on small lot sizes. We have several programs today that make, as I alluded to before, the same bargain that Paul Douglas and Hubert Humphrey made 70 years ago. The biggest one is the low-income housing tax credit. Perhaps many of you are familiar with that. It's a subsidy that the federal government gives to builders of housing that's affordable to low and moderate income families. The Federal Treasury Department regulations for this low-income housing tax credit place a priority on placing developments that house low-income families in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. How crazy is that? We could very easily modify those Treasury Department regulations, not so that we don't build any housing in existing low-income neighborhoods, but to certainly place a higher priority in building them in those places where we challenge those exclusionary zoning ordinances. Same thing's true of the Section 8 program that many of you are familiar with. It's a subsidy to individual families to enable them to afford housing without paying more than 30% of their income in rent. The Section 8 program primarily reinforces segregation because the only place, or mostly the only place, not the only place, but mostly the only place where landlords will accept Section 8 vouchers is in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. Well, that program could also be reformed so that we restructured the program so that it provided subsidies that enabled families to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods where they had access to good jobs, and good schools, and opportunity. Well, as I say, I could go on and on about these policies. I will someday, actually, but we know what the policies are. What's missing? What's missing is not the policies. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like the one that existed in the 20th century, that's going to make it too uncomfortable for us to maintain the present system of segregation without enacting these policies. And as I look out at all of you, I have to say that that's not up to my generation, that's up to yours. So I hope you will begin to think of yourselves as citizens, as residents of this community, as people who have an obligation to remedy the civil rights violations that our government has created, and participate in that new civil rights movement. I am engaged with a number of other older people, but some young, like myself, to try to give support to such an organization, and we will be announcing it perhaps sometime in the next year, and I hope when we do so, many of you will join with us in redressing the segregation that we've created. So with that, I'll stop, and I guess, Amy, we're going to have some questions, and I'd be glad to answer them.